Okay, but listen, CNFers, I'm not one for many ads on this show. I don't actively court them. I only do them usually for cross-promotional purposes. The IRS doesn't get involved with that. This show takes a lot of time, and part of what keeps the lights on at CNF Pod HQ is if maybe you'll hire me to help edit or coach up your work. A generous editor helps you see what you can't see. I know that's why I solicit one. If you need help cracking the code, man, you can email me at creativenonfictionpodcast@gmail.com and we can start a dialogue, okay?
It was just sliding into like a hot tub of weird jumbled memories. And then, okay, I could actually regurgitate some of it in a way that might make sense.
Oh, hey, CNFers, it's the Creative Nonfiction Podcast, that show since 2013, where I talk to primarily writers about telling true stories. I'm your host, Brendan O'Meara. Given that the Stanley Cup Final is soon to be underway between the Edmonton Oilers and the Florida Panthers, what better time to air this interview with Sam Jefferies, author of Legacy on Ice, Blake Geoffrion, and The Fastest Game on Earth. It is published by the University of Wisconsin Press. Very few people know who Geoffrion is, but imagine a baseball player today being, say, 3 or 4 generations removed from, Babe Ruth. And that's Blake. His grandfather, Boom Boom Geoffrion, depending on who you ask, either invented the slap shot or popularized it. And maybe that makes Babe Ruth and that analogy all the more germane. Home runs were nothing new when Babe Ruth came along, but he certainly popularized and propagated the home run, among other things. Point being, Sam chronicled the burden of this legacy in Blake's injury-shortened career as a professional hockey player. And he delves into the mythos around college hockey, specifically in the Midwest, where schools like Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan live and breathe hockey. We talk about how Sam built scenes, folded in his book writing and reporting around his family and day job, listening to tape on commutes to get the material into his bloodstream, and maintaining a sense of individual style without, exhausting the reader. Show notes to this episode and more are at brendanomeara.com, where you can also sign up for my Rage Against the Algorithm newsletter. I might be upping the frequency of the newsletter as I continue my emigration from social media. That's going to be, some experimentation in there as I try to promote a forthcoming book without social media at all. I will lean on the permission assets of the newsletter in this podcast. Far more valuable than trying to get into the attention industrial complex that is social media. Plus, it just makes me feel crappy all the time. Why would I? So it's like, would you have an alcoholic go into a bar and say, well, it's good for your career to be in this bar, even though it's tempting and bad for the alcoholic to even be there? That's kind of my analogy of it. It's just bad for me to be there. And I'm not good, quote, at social media. That's neither here nor there. I'm going off script, you can tell. If you dig this show, consider sharing it or leaving a review on Apple Podcast. If you do, I will coach up a piece of your writing of up to 2,000 words. Email the show at Creative Nonfiction Podcast with a screenshot of your review once it posts, and then we'll start a dialogue there. This is often a great way for you to get a sense of what it's like for me to edit on a bigger scale, so you can get a little appetizer of it. And if you kind of like how it goes, you can consider hiring me. It's okay. We do okay. Okay. So Sam is a communications professional and freelancer based out of Seattle. His work has appeared in the Seattle Times, Sports Business Journal, Newsweek, and elsewhere. And so we're going to get to that. We are. Parting shot on adriftness and a blood pressure reading of 146/93. So let's get into it, CNFers. I think I hear the crashing of the boards. Riff. UW email address. I thought you were like a total West Coast, Seattle alum. I didn't realize until I read the bio on the back of your book that that you went to Wisconsin or University of Madison, Wisconsin.
I'm from the Northwest originally, and then I went to the Midwest, and then was gone 12 years total from the West Coast and came back. So I'm home now, but yeah, I spent a fair bit of time on the ground in Madison, that's for sure.
Yeah. What was the draw to head that way for you?
So I had two uncles play hockey for Wisconsin. I had kind of a cousin of mine founded the Onion, the newspaper The Onion, on campus in Madison. Yeah, back in 1988. And so there's a bit of a family tradition that some had moved away from, and then I moved back to.
Did you overlap with Blake then when you were at Wisconsin?
I did.
Okay.
Yeah, 3 or 4 years. So I saw him play, and I was there during his senior season, during the Hobie Baker year.
And so when you were at Wisconsin, were you focused on sports journalism at the time?
Not at all. No, I was history and political science majors. I definitely got bitten by the political bug and loved sports, was a hockey season ticket holder, went to a ton of football, some basketball, but sports journalism wasn't really on my radar at all, and not the career path I've chosen either. And it was something that truly creative nonfiction in the sports realm was something that I found after college, and then couldn't put enough of it up my nose.
Yeah. With respect to that, I always love finding out like that, be it a book or a magazine article, something that you read it and it just like totally like turned your world from black and white into color. And I've got stories and books that did that to me. And so for you, since you kind of came into it not as a career choice, it just kind of lit you up in some way. What were some of those pieces that you were like, oh shit, like this is amazing?
The Last American Hero is Junior Johnson, by Tom Wolfe, which he wrote for Esquire. Blew my hair back. It's in Best American Sports Writing of the Century, and it is gratuitous new journalism in every sense of the word. Just flying along, and pages of run-on sentences, and really indulgent as far as color after color after color in a single paragraph, and I was so hooked, and it was so absolutely unbelievable. And there are others I've since found. I mean, I remember the weekend of the Mayweather Pacquiao fight, ordering a bunch of Norman Mailer and W.C. Hines, and getting really into that kind of golden era of boxing, sports journalism. But you never forget your first, right? I will always remember Tom Wolfe on Junior Johnson talking about the move from the bootleggers to the dirt track stock car racing in the South. And I think I've been to one car race in my life. It's not really something I have any interest in, but that story made the hair stand up on the back of my neck.
Is that something you revisit from time to time?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It minimum once a year, and that's definitely part of my writing process too. Is I would really, to get things going, would go back and look at some of the standout pieces for me, I think, in the history of sports journalism, and that's one of them where I could go and I could read 3 paragraphs and just be keyed to the moon, and then sit in front of a laptop and start absolutely hammering out Screed.
Yeah, it's kind of like when like an a cappella group gets up there and they like blow into that whistle tuner or whatever that
Yeah,
is,
right.
and then they go off and sing.
Absolutely.
It's kind of like that, right?
100%. Absolutely, absolutely. Same thing, and yeah, you hear that one note, and that story for me and others too, but that story in particular will always bring me back in key.
I've been just through the research I've been doing. I've been in Sports Illustrated vault, reading a lot of the stuff from the late '60s, early '70s, and just those stories were just so good, so tight and voice driven and evocative. And I'm always like, how do they get these quotes and paint these scenes? Like this was such a golden age of sports journalism in that era. I mean, not entirely representative, but at least the writing was just
Right.
so good.
Absolutely, absolutely. No, they could really write their socks off, and I think for me, sports agnostic, right? Do it in a way that made crew and made stock car racing and made whatever it was just as interesting as for me more core sports like hockey or baseball, things that I consider myself a fan of.
Yeah, I think that's important too, especially if people even nowadays want to try to break into sports writing or anything. It's like try to find something that's a bit esoteric or on the fringes, mainly because they don't get as much coverage, so you might get greater access. Like similar to you, like even though hockey is
Hmm.
mainstream, it's not as mainstreamy as football and basketball or even baseball. So it's kind of like you can kind of get your way in to the and get some access. Is that something that you experience with, especially with your Blake Jefferies story?
Oh, very much so. I mean, hockey is a niche sport, and that's only not true in Canada, right? And
Right.
and for me, Canada was harder to break into. Getting the superstars on the phone was more difficult. But in the United States, I could talk to pretty much anyone I wanted. Blake was a big help for that, for sure. But it's a fairly small community. The sports writer and then the coaches carousel is an even smaller community around that. And then, there, I was looking today, you have college teams that are flying around on planes around the country playing in these unbelievable state of the art arenas, and yet they're still farming out broadcasting or stat keeping to volunteers or to guys who are essentially hometown stringers, and then those guys are just treasure troves of stories and information and history that all lives upstairs. So that was definitely an asset for me for sure.
Mm. And circling back to a moment ago about talking about Tom Wolfe and like the indulgent, over the top writing, and that over stylized stuff can be really, it's exciting to read, but can also be very dangerous as a writer as you try to maybe impersonate it a little bit because only a few people can dance close to that fire. And just for you over the course of the writing you've done, have you noticed that you sometimes flew too close to that sun? You're like, I can't, I'm gonna
Oh,
fall to
oh,
earth.
without a doubt, without a doubt. I remember very distinctly a friend of mine had read an early draft, I think of a single chapter, and he said, "If you write like this for a whole book, you're gonna wear everybody out." And I
Hmm.
thought that really stuck with me. Is that I can I could write it all like that, and I think I can do it pretty well. Uh, but pretty well and Tom Wolfe are two different things, and it is exhausting to read. I mean, it really it does drain your eyes, your brain, your heart as it's skipping along. To read a story like that that's written in that style all the time, and I think that was actually really helpful to say, okay, it's not that I can't, I can even do this and make it incredibly compelling, but I'm not writing a magazine piece. I'm writing a book, and I got to give people an opportunity to breathe too.
Yeah, yeah, it's kind of like an action movie. If it's just nonstop action, it's like
Right,
we do need some moments to slow down.
right, right. And then every car gets blown up, and then it's never special, right? You don't miss the Aston Martin because you're on to the next one.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of like the last John Wick movie.
Yeah,
Like
for
John
sure.
Wick 4 is just like constant
Right.
action and murder, and it was
Yep.
like, all right, we need to slow down a little bit. Nope, we're definitely not slowing down at all.
We got a budget and we're gonna spend it, right?
Exactly, we're going out with a bang.
Yep.
Now, uh, getting access to people, especially at the start of a book project, can be really, really hard, and it's so important to get that first one. And just so happens, I think the first one happened to be your central figure, and that really opens up the door for you. So maybe let's just talk a little bit about how you were able to curry access to Blake, and how you lobbied him to be like, this is what I'd love to do and how I'd like to handle it.
Yeah, honestly, I think it's two part. Is one, the way I did it the first time, and then two, how very late in the process he ended up really finally trusting me and opening up in ways that he hadn't before, and being forthcoming the way I needed him to be. But early on, I mean, I did a ton of research. I really wasn't talking to a lot of people, but doing all of the archival research and going back and watching game film that I could, and reading gamers, and examining his career, and then building a pitch case that I think ends up being similar to a query for a publisher, but for the subject. And then when I did finally approach him, the chase was its own story, and I have actually, in doing book promotion with him, I've heard a funny wrinkle about it. I ended up finding an email address for him, writing what I thought was a very compelling outreach email, which said in part, I think your story is being forgotten. It had been, almost 10 years since he'd played. And I obviously I wrote a book about the man. I think he has an incredibly compelling story that deserves to be told. But it was not. There was an old ESPN the magazine piece from back in the day that John Buccigross had written, and that was it. And so that was part of my opening, and then also trying to emphasize to him some of the extraordinary elements of his path, that it it was unusual in ways that even he hadn't thought of, and that probably are impossible to see if you're living it rather than watching it. And that was enough for at least the first conversation, and then really making that pitch. But he ended up telling me later that, because I had simultaneously reached out to the University of Wisconsin as well, looking for contact information, and the longtime athletic director, Barry Alvarez, who's a very famous figure in college sports, called him and he said, "Hey, there's some guy named Sam Jefferies sniffing around, asking to try and get a hold of you. Are you comfortable with us sharing your contact information?" And Blake had gotten my email, the same week, and I think he kind of laughed and said, "You know what? I'll email him back. But thanks for the heads up." So I only heard that story since the book has come out. But it took forever and ever to get him to open up and to give me longer answers, and he was willing to give me access to anyone and everyone, introducing me to coaches and trainers and players and guys who were still in the NHL, and NHL coaches, and senior international hockey figures and that type of thing. But the real truths about what he went through, and how hard his injury recovery was, and all these very challenging paths that he was kind of forced to take, he didn't open up until I had spoken to his wife several times, his now wife, his long-time girlfriend, and his parents, but his mother specifically. And it was only when I could come back to him and share some of those details that he finally said, implicitly if not explicitly, "Okay, I can really give this guy the straight answers."
Yeah, I always go back to Richard Ben Kramer, longtime Esquire writer,
Mm-hmm.
wrote maybe the greatest profile of all time on Ted Williams, and he was always big on finding the women to talk to. They just have they just for one they just tend to know. They're more detail oriented in general. Like painting with a broad brush, but like you talk to them, and it's
Yeah.
just like the
Right.
details are so much more vibrant. Like dudes, especially athletes, who's like, yeah, whatever, blah 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 blah. But
Right.
you talk to girlfriends or wives or whatever, and you start to really see what they see, and they see things just a lot differently, and that just really rounds out the picture.
Oh yeah, and and to be clear, Richard Ben Kramer is very much on my shelf of, you know, guys I need to hoover up, writers I need to hoover up to get my engine started writing. And but it is so true, and I really found that in a big way. And his mom telling me about getting his original skating instructor 20 plus 25 20 years later to come to his contract signing at his elementary school when he could barely tell me the year he'd signed his first contract. And she's telling me what the picture looked like and where they went to the framing store to get it pictured, and then what it was like. One of my favorite details, doing his laundry when he was a professional NHL hockey player, but living at home when he was in Nashville because he'd been drafted by his hometown team. And here she is, laundering some of his gear just as she did when he was in the Pee Wees. But yeah, the ask the women, talk to the women. I write that on my forehead. It is that was such a true truism for sure.
And the thing you said about Blake too, in lobbying him to tell the story about how his story and was being forgotten, and that harkens back to what when I spoke with Howard Bryant about his Ricky Henderson biography. Part of him lobbying Ricky was telling him, like, listen, like, the people who know who you are probably like kind of in their 50s, maybe in their 40s, and he's just like, people are going to forget, and we need to keep these stories alive, and it falls at the feet of journalists and biographers to ultimately do that. And Ricky ended up kind of pulling the plug on some of the access that Howard had, but that's part of lobbying these people too. Is just like, you might think that people aren't going to forget, but people will inevitably forget. So it's really important to kind of drive that home, because that's how these books are what's going to keep, say, Blake's story alive.
Yeah, well, Blake's story, and the story of college hockey at that time, and when he understood that by telling his story, I could tell his team's story and the program story and all these elements, his family story. Then I think he understood that it could be indulgent without being selfish to tell it to me and have me tell it.
Yeah, that's the other thing too. Like, any good biography is not just about the central figure, it's about the world building in the ecosystem. And like, so maybe speak to that, about the world that you created here that goes beyond Blake.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think the family element is so important, and it's a big part of what drew me to him. That he's the first fourth generation NHL player. Maybe the last. What a bizarre and remarkable thing. But then on top of that, the story between generations of expectation and weight of a legacy, however big or small that is. I mean, for him, it is big. Of course, his great grandfather and his grandfather are both in the Hall of Fame. Grandfather invented the slap shot. I mean, the guy played under the banners of two of the patriarchs of his family in the most storied arena in professional hockey. Like, that's a crazy thing. But also, his father dropped the ball and ended up, for circumstances, some of which I get in the book, busting out of the league. And I thought that was so much more resonant. And no, how many of us have famous fathers or grandfathers or great grandfathers? It's fairly unusual, but to inherit a family story or family history that is where the link has been broken, or it's been tarnished in some ways, and there to be an expectation on you as the next generation to whether it's bring it back or make it better, or change the trajectory of where your family's headed, and in the kind of grand American tradition. That was so incredible and compelling to me, and that's what I really wanted to dig into when I found out about it. I mean, it was uncomfortable too because I really came to like his dad. His father's an incredible storyteller. He's got this great French Canadian accent,
Mhm.
and he can talk for hours. He's got one liners, and he's incredibly generous with how he talks about things, and a lot more candid than I really ever found Blake to be until very late in the process. Part of what he handed to his son, and that it kind of fell to Blake to repair, was a legacy, was a family history, both recent and further back, that needed some repairing, and that went so far beyond hockey and went so far beyond Blake's story, and I think ended up being a real central part of what the book became.
Yeah, you could replace hockey with like inheriting the family bricklaying business, or
Absolutely.
right, like it's that kind of pressure that someone's like, all right, are you going to take up the family thing, or are you going to do your own thing, and then you got to shoulder possibly that guilt that maybe like, all right, I can't do this any longer, I need to kind of find my own identity.
Yeah, yeah, and I think it's true for a lot of immigrant stories as well, where you have first generation immigrants who come to the United States really hungry and entrepreneurial and ambitious, and some of that ambition, goes away over time, and it falls to that third or fourth generation to consider what they need to do with it when they're compelled to do with it, and whether they want to walk away entirely.
In your interactions with Blake, did you find that when his career was over and it kind of ended, pretty like much shorter than he would have wanted because of injury, but did you get a sense of relief from him when it ended?
Yeah, I think it was really telling for me. He gets injured. He goes on a bit of a mental rehab vacation. We go to Mexico. They stay on the beach. Him and his fiance at the time, his now wife, and it was one of the first vacations. Is their first vacation ever together, and it was one of the first vacations I think he'd been on in a very very long time. And that's elite youth athletes in across North America today, right? As you get identified at a really young age, even beyond North America, but identified at a really young age, and then all you do is play that sport all the time for 20 years, and you don't really have any friends left who aren't hockey friends or baseball friends or soccer friends or whatever it is, and you that is your entire identity, and so I think he ended up going into hockey after and becoming a professional scout, and has since moved away from that. And I think I've sensed more and more of that relief even as I had started the book research process, because that all-consuming nature and weight and identity being centered in what's relatively simple game is a lot to carry.
Yeah, when you were having conversations, I don't know, with him, and you always often go back to people and talking with people, and it's what was the most challenging thing for you, just as the reporter and researcher, be it making cold calls or going back to people, what did you find is some of the more challenges unique to your process or your this book?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I fell victim to was chasing more famous names and thinking that they were the key to the story. Patrick Kane is one that stands out for me, where he, is one of the great American players of all time, and three-time Stanley Cup winner, and Team USA superstar internationally, all of these things. And he was Blake's roommate when they were in high school at the National Team Development Program. And I really, I think, put so much weight for me into that level of interview right? Oh, look at this access that I get
Mm-hmm.
to an NHL superstar who's willing to talk to me, and he didn't have very much to say. And that was such a blow. And it happened, a few times elsewhere where I had gotten head coaches, I had gotten, ESPN type figures or others like that, and they added very little to the book that I was trying to write, the research I was trying to do, and finding instead that coach two or three coaches before who had been fired and was disgruntled and was willing to be a little more gloves off and say, sure, they stabbed me in the back, I'll tell you whatever you want to ask. I'm bouncing around in a back of a bus, going across South Dakota coaching some junior B team. Those were the great stories, but it really took so long for me to learn that it's frankly irrelevant how successful or what a big name you are in this process, because if you're not that valuable as a source, maybe you're still in the game and you're not willing to give quotes, or maybe it's just your personality where you live and breathe this sport, and stepping back and talking about it in a little more poetic or raw way, whatever the case may be, just isn't a muscle that you have. I chased this one trainer
Yeah.
forever. He was a longtime trainer for one of the programs that Blake was involved with, and I finally got a hold of him. I'll never forget it. I was in a bookstore picking out a 5-year-old birthday gift so that my daughter could take to a birthday party, and this guy who had been chasing for weeks finally calls me, and I said, whatever, I'm gonna hit record on my app, and I'm gonna take this call. And I hung up after about 5 minutes because it was just, there was nothing to be had there. And I don't know if it was because he had been around other players who had also succeeded, or he just, was a guy born to fold towels. I don't know what it was, but that was such a blow, right? And you spend so much time trying to schedule, especially for me, not having as much luxury about my own daytime schedule, trying to do that, and getting him on the phone, and just just romancing the stone.
Yeah, it's the worst when you think you got someone good and then they just, like you said, there's maybe born to fold towels. You're like, oh damn! Like it seemed like that person would be like the one who would he would know
Sure,
some
you've
really
seen it
great stuff.
all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When given that you have like a day job and a family, I know a lot of people who do this kind of work, they don't necessarily have the luxury to be like just doing the book all the time, etc. And you've been able to fold your reporting and your research and your writing around a very full life. So like, what was the kind of the shape of your days like when you were in the midst of it?
Yeah, I think some of it was trying to buy myself time to then use later and be flexible. And so I worked East Coast hours for a little while. I'm on the West Coast now, but I was working East Coast hours for some of it. And so I'd get up at 5 and I'd work from 5 to 7 so that I could do what was essentially a lunch hour interview, right? And be able to hop off or spend, time in the middle of the day rereading newspaper articles or watching game film or rereading my own notes, whatever it was. And that I found was helpful, and also just helpful as a motivation. Like, listen, you wake up at 4:30, you work from 5 to 7. You really bought that time back for yourself. You better damn well use it. And so that was motivating for me too, in addition to just good time management. And then the writing was always at night. I obviously listened to your podcast forever. I've heard a million people who are 500 words before the crack of dawn, or whatever it is that their system. That is not me. It doesn't matter how much Tom Wolfe I read. I am not gonna write early in the morning. But I would put my kids down, and they'd be down by 8 o'clock, and disappear downstairs, and I'd write from 8 to 11, and then I'd be absolutely hosed, because I was so jacked on the writing that I couldn't turn my brain off, and I'd be going a million miles an hour. I remember reading this great Michael Lewis story about he almost missed the birth of one of his kids because he was writing a book on deadline, trying to get it done before his child was born, and writing at night and then knocking himself out with a few glasses of cheap red wine so that he could sleep and turn his writer's brain off. And I really felt that. But so there was some sleep deprivation for sure. But I found that 8 to 11 p.m. window was my sweet spot to write. And then I think the other part of fitting it in, because I recorded all of my interviews on an app, tape a call, and then they're housed in the app and I could re-listen to them. So I would actually listen on my commute in preparation for writing that night. I'm headed home, I'm moving between meetings, whatever it was, and I'd pop it in as I'm driving around and re-listen to that. And there's a cruelty to that. I loathe the sound of my own voice.
Right.
Ironic, as I'm doing a podcast
I
right
know.
now.
Me too, dude. Me too.
Well, listen to you is a trip, because I listen to my podcast on time and a half, and so that's I've been conditioned to that sound of your voice for years now. But yeah, that was so helpful. As I know I'm going to be writing about 1999 and the creation of this USA Hockey program. I'm going to go back and I'm going to listen to that Jordan Leopold interview on the drive home and remember it and refresh myself with those details. And then, so when 8 o'clock comes, it's all top of mind and I can bang, bang, bang and knock out whatever is ahead of me that day.
Yeah, that's something I wish I might still do that. That's something I wish I've done more, because you have just like so many hours of tape, some of which you haven't even listened to. You don't even know where some of the information even is anymore. And you just like listen to it and you just let it like infuse your brain. And you're like, okay, like,
Totally.
yeah, like, oh, there's this detail here, and I've read my manuscript 6,000 times, so I basically can recite that by heart. And it's like, oh, you got this new detail. You're like, I know exactly where to go in it, and you just like, take a little bit of that paint and you'll layer in a little more color, and it's just like, but yeah, it's the redundancy. Building those redundancies in is a great way to just ensure that all that work you've done doesn't go to waste.
Yeah, and that you're not reading it too, right? Because same, I had read my manuscript so many times. I tried all the tricks. I put it in a different font. I'd print it out. It looked the same to me. And then reading the transcript, I'd transcribe some interviews, and it had the same effect. But the listening was a real help, because it was just sliding into like a hot tub. Of weird jumbled memories, and then okay, I could actually regurgitate some of it in a way that might make sense.
Yeah, and I love hearing the way you structured your days with these really tight windows, be it to watch game film, read stuff, or write. And a lot of people, I think, maybe underestimate the amount of work they can get done in a tight window. If that's all you got and you can really focus, like I bet, I always sometimes tell people just to set a timer for as little as like 10 to 20 minutes.
Oh yeah.
Do that, and you'll be surprised what you can get done, and then that momentum builds on itself. So was that something you've always been good at, or just something that you really coached yourself to do, especially for this, just given the shape of your life?
Both. I had to do that for a long time, especially in the professional space, and really being time limited on how I can respond to things, and writing under a deadline, not in a reporting sense, but in a professional sense. But that is accelerated in a big way, with family life, and with kids in particular, and so I took that on and applied it in a very rigorous way. And it served me very well, because every once in a while I'd feel, okay, I had good momentum on Friday or Thursday, and I'm going to roll into Saturday and I'm going to dedicate a chunk to my day. And, that's when I ended up goofing off, and I'd read, too many pages of somebody else's book, and I'd get too lost in their stylistic attributes, or I'd have stuck on me a single sentence that probably didn't even belong in there at all, and I'd spend an hour trying to fix it. So it really served me well to have been forced to be regimented in that way. And I think if I had a deadline for the book, it would have even, it would have even been more accelerated in, kind of a healthy fashion.
And just as you've put down a lot of words and started to you just develop as a writer and everything, who has given you, or what is some advice that you've stumbled across, be it in a book or from just someone you respect, that that has really helped you, propel you forward to finish this book and hopefully be able to sort of take this one and light the cigarette of the next book?
Sure, sure. So, well, early on, I remember speaking of Glenn Stout, talking to Glenn Stout, and that was a really cool moment in and of itself. And I remember him telling me, that when you go in to describe a scene, and a sports scene in particular, because these games, game after game, start to sound exactly the same, and it's a crazy, almost hypocrisy, where on the one hand, the only reason this guy deserves a book is because of what he did in the sport he played, and on the other hand, when you get to writing it, you hear from people they don't actually want to hear as much about the sport. They don't want to. They want to reread about games. They want to read about the guy and the human nature that ended up being complicated and compelling, and everything else. But I remember Glenn telling me the need to put yourself in multiple angles when you're retelling sports scenes in particular: player, opposing player, referee or coach, fan, and media. And thinking about that in that way was such a useful part of an exercise for me. And then I could then say, okay, that makes sense, because if I do this all from this thick blade of Blake Jefferies, it's going to be like watching a GoPro, which is the most boring video in the world. It's got to be more than that. It's got to be somebody from somebody sitting in the stands, and thinking about it from a fan standpoint, or an opponent, or any of those positions that I just rattled off. And then another one, I don't want to give away your milk for free, Brendan, but is some of the advice that you gave me, and the getting away from Blake was such a danger zone, and finding ways to insert him back into the narrative. I mean, even thinking about this conversation, and kicking the book open, I remember there's a section when I'm essentially covering American amateur hockey from the late 90s to the mid 2000s, and he ends up joining this program in the mid 2000s. There's a big chunk of time, which is really important and is relevant, but doesn't mention him. And going back and being able to include a sentence about, Blake Geoffrion was 12 years old at the time, and these kinds of games were out of even his ability to envision. But everything that happened influenced everything that happened after, including the trajectory he ended up on. I wrote it better than that, but that's the essence of it.
Yeah.
And, that was advice from you that I thought was so powerful, in finding ways to bring him back in and to Tetris this thing back together in a way that reminded people of why a story about him could carry these other tales.
Mm. I love how you brought up the Glenn's way of like triangulating a scene
Mm-hmm.
from all those different angles, and something I've wanted to do more with people on the show too is to try to maybe pick out a scene from the book and like how, and kind of deconstruct it and how you built it. So I don't know if there's a scene that pops up in your head in the book that where you were able to deploy a lot of those techniques to be able to really round out something. So if something stands out to you, I'd love to hear how you went about it and used all those different resources to make something that was really evocative.
Yeah, no, I'll tell you exactly what it is, and it's a scene where Blake gets injured, and those who haven't read the book, first of all, go read the book, but second of all, it's it is such a pinnacle scene, in this is everything he's worked for, and worked for or not, this is really the life he's ever known, snatched away from him because of a freak accident. And I interviewed teammates, I interviewed coaches, but really, hopefully, the Montreal Canadiens beat reporter for the Montreal Gazette, which is the English language daily in Montreal, was at that game, but as a fan. And then ended up covering it because he was in the stands. And so he told me this story through both. So, okay, I got fan and I have reporter, bang, bang, all in one, because the guy's a 30-year beat reporter, and he's a master of, differentiating those perspectives himself. And then his parents were in attendance as well, in a bizarre twist of fate. He's got brothers. They were playing collegiate hockey too, and they happened to fly up to Montreal on their way to Boston, seeing one kid before seeing another, and in a very like parents at Little League tournament kind of way, which is funny because he's playing pro hockey at the time. So I get to hear their perspective, and then I talked to the trainer who originally examined him, and then the surgeon who examined him, and also watched the game footage to understand what he was dealing with before opening him up. And that was such. I remember writing the scene. It both opens and kind of closes the book, and then going back and trying to more intensely apply that triage perspective in the second recounting, because my interviews had been so rich, and because that camera one, camera two perspective lent itself in so many ways to a moment that he couldn't remember, because the guy was playing a hockey game and woke up, essentially 2 days later in a hospital.
There's in the Pixar movie Ratatouille, one of my favorite movies. There's deleted scenes with commentary from the director Brad Bird, and it's one of the great attributes of that particular commentary, because he's really explaining, as much as there was a good scene, why it needed to go. And it was, and I bring that up because I wonder if there was just something that you wrote and reported in this book that it just didn't, you loved it, but it just ultimately it had to go as much as you invested in it. You know what I mean?
Oh, I know what you mean, and it's not one thing; it's 20,000 things.
Right.
They cut 20,000 words from it. Look what they did to my boy. It was awful. I turned in my first draft, even the draft that you and I worked on together, and they said no, none of this works. You got it. I'll take it all out. And some of it they were right about, and some of it they were really wrong about. And I have since been validated and kind of fighting to keep portions of it, because I knew they were wrong. And I had, fortunately, I had talked to you, or I had talked to one other close friend who was involved in the process, and they said, this is you at your best, and this is great writing that is important to the story. And so I was able to kind of defend that. But man, I sacrificed a lot of prose to get there. And my last one, the last cut that I will never forget, is the what they call the water bottle game, which is in the early 80s. There's a massive fight between Wisconsin and North Dakota. Somebody got sprayed with a water bottle and ended up being in this brawl, and there were fights with the cops in the stands. And it was, for me, one, it's just a cool story, but two, a reminder of how far we have moved away from kind of rough and tumble collegiate athletics to a world in where these 19-year-old kids got a camera crew following them around, and every move is broadcast to the world, and all that. And these guys are brawling in the beer garden, and they sent them home. It's just, it's a little more Wild West time. The taking it out part was so hard, because my non-player angle in that story and in telling that scene was a guy named Rob Andringa, who, he was a 13-year-old stick boy at the time, happened to be neighbors with the coach, and was sitting on the bench just like a bat boy would in the dugout in baseball. And so he ends up in this brawl. There's grown men fighting around him, all wearing skates, and spilling over in the stands, and they're fighting the fans. And he told me this story in this amazing and compelling and fun way, and then ended up going on to be co-captain on a national championship winning team at Wisconsin, and one of my favorite interviews of the whole process. And then he passed away from cancer before the book was published, and
Mm.
really young. I think he was 53, and left behind a fairly young family, and I had to leave his storytelling on the cutting room floor. And yes, ultimately it was right. That it didn't serve the needs of the narrative at that time, but there was a real cost to it. And I've shared the book with his widow, and she shared it with his kids, and I'm so privileged to have been able to tell this story and tell that, and I shared with her the portions that have been cut, but she's the only one who's seen them, and that was just such a loss.
Mm. Yeah, and some of the book promo and marketing you're doing is it kind of in conjunction with Blake as well, and
Mm-hmm.
that strikes me as certainly unique in that usually you don't see like the writer and like the central figure like just together on the
Sure.
scene. Usually afterwards you're just like Tracy Kidder once said he saw one of his central figures in a book and he's just like out he saw him out in public. He's like, "What are you doing? Like, get back in my book. Like, get back there where you belong." And but yeah, but you and Blake are kind of like co-pilot on this and
Sure.
co for the event. Not that this is
Yeah,
like an
yeah,
as told
sure,
to, you
yeah,
know what I mean? So
yeah.
what's that dynamic like for you?
Bizarre. It's been absolutely bizarre. I mean, I am sitting next to the guy telling a story, having told a story about what he didn't become, right? I mean, what he failed to achieve, and not because of lack of hard work, it's a freak injury, but either way, it's something that really it was taken away from him. And it is so strange to sit next to a guy and then say that, talk about his thoughts of suicide, talk about all of this I mean, incredibly dark times of his life, and have him sit next to me and like, don't forget, buy a copy for your cousin or whatever. Right? It is bizarre. And then two, I think there it's hard for me as a writer that it's been mistaken that we co-wrote the book, and we
Yeah.
didn't. He offered a ton of access, and opened a ton of doors for me, answered my questions, but also introduced me to people that would have been much harder to chase down, that type of thing. And since I think there's been a greater appetite to have us on jointly or do joint book signings or that type of thing, which is great for the book and sales and promotion and all that. But it's still a little like, hey, this was I did the work. You took some phone calls with me. I did the work, so that's that's a little raw. But he's on the flip side. Even when we've had interviewers that really are more interested in talking to him than to me, he's brought it back to the book, and he's kind of been a shameless plugger and that type of thing. So that's really cool. And I've had some funny moments too where we did a joint book signing, and he brought his kids, and they were selling the book at the bookstore. So you could buy the book, and then they had jot cards where he could just sign his autograph too if people wanted that. And his kids are using them to doodle on, right? They're drawing pictures and things like that. And I said to his daughter, I go, you're a lot of people know your daddy, and she goes, yeah, he's famous. And I said, yes, he is. And then she turns to me and she goes, are you famous? And I said, well, I think I am today. So that's been a trip too, right? And talking to the people around him who are are interested in the book because it's about the person that's sitting next to me.
Nowadays, athletes by and large, they have the power to really control their own stories. And that's like whether it's producing documentaries that feature them, it's like, yeah, maybe they'll give you one little like nose picker detail, but by and large, it's to make them look great, be it the last dance or whatever Tom Brady's doing lately or whatever. And so how important is it for for us, and even just for you as a reader and a writer, to be a biographer of someone that is divorced from their their capacity to editorially control that message.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't been on the other side of it, and nobody asked me to produce The Last Dance, and I'm sure whoever did got paid quite well. What a what a phenomenon that was. But I felt that retaining that control was so important, and Blake and I went back and forth on a couple different stories and what to include and how to frame things, and he wasn't wild about some of the stories that I had chosen to include. And my favorite was a portrait of a coach of his, which was less than flattering. And he ended up wanting me to connect with the coach, and I got more from his story, and it ended up being such a better part of the book because he was uncomfortable with it. But I mean, I do think retaining that editorial independence is so critical. Although I will say it's true for both the subject, and in my instance, it's true for the publisher, who had a very different vision and wanted me to shoehorn in certain topics that I felt would be inappropriate. Things like discussion of CTE and stuff like that, which is definitely deserves all the research and attention it's getting, but is not relevant to a guy who took a skate to the head. We're just talking about very different head injuries, and so I felt myself retaining that editorial independence in two directions, and I felt that both were equally important.
Very nice. Well, Sam, as you know, I love to bring these conversations down for a landing by asking the guest for a recommendation of some kind, just anything you're excited about. So I would just like pose that to you as we bring this airliner down for a landing.
Yeah. You know, it's not. Oh, I guess the nonfiction one, because we're on the creative nonfiction podcast, that I would recommend is this book called Shadow Divers. I don't know if you've ever heard of this, but
No.
it was, I believe it's self-published, and it is Shadow Divers: The True Adventures of Two Americans Who Risked Everything to Solve One of the Last Mysteries of World War II. It came out in 2004, and I'd never heard of it. I don't know who the author is, not a name, in the community or anything. And it ended up being exactly what it says on, label on the can is correct, right? That these divers, these recreational divers, discovered this unbelievable World War II mystery in the North Atlantic, and they did it in the most rinky-dink way. And talking about, like, I don't care about diving, just like I don't care about stock car racing. And this book was cool. It was something else. It was cool in kind of a treasure hunting way. It was cool in the writing and in the depth of characters for the guys who were involved in the discovery and reclamation and in the history as well. So that was a surprise, but or definitely a diamond in the rough for sure.
Well, what's cool about books like that is that they take you to a place that you've never been before. They build a world, and
Totally.
yeah, like I always kind of use it as an example. The novel "Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow" by Gabrielle Zevin that came out like a year or two ago, and it's basically about gaming and gamers and game developers, uh, and it's not and it's fiction, but and the two main characters at the forefront of it. Like just didn't find them very. I just didn't enjoy their presence on the
Right.
page. They kind of just I found them irritating. But the world that she built in this novel was fascinating enough where I couldn't wait to get back to it. So that's always a great element of any book, and nonfiction can do that in particular. It takes you to this subculture.
For sure. No, it's almost childlike for me, right? Where, as a kid, when you really start getting into reading and understanding what that transportation to another world and another setting, another time, whatever it is, a book can do for you. And you lose that as you get older and are a reader and are a writer and have been through the laundry cycle of publishing and all that. But every once in a while, stumbling on these that have earned that transport for you is a pretty special a special reminder.
Oh, fantastic. Well, Sam, I'm so glad we were able to do this. We've had a lot of conversations on the phone in the past, and it's nice to get this one on tape, so to speak, to celebrate, your wonderful book about Blake. So, thanks for coming on the show, man.
No, thank you. And I don't know if you're going to include this or not, but for anybody listening, our collaboration could not have been better. And I'm just so deeply grateful for you making this book possible. I remember you writing to me about feeling like, in your own writing, feeling like you were on the 5-yard line and really you were pinned up against your own goal line. And I thought, oh, no way for me, right? No way, because I just need postage and someone's going to give me a Pulitzer. I just need to know where to send it. And of course, that ended up not being true. And 8 drafts later, there I was finally shipping off a manuscript. But I don't say this casually, facetiously. It would not have been possible without you and your expertise and the collaborative friendship that we built, because you absolutely wrecked my first draft. You weren't particularly kind to the later ones either, but it was everything that I needed. And the book that is sitting next to me, is a testament to that.
Awesome. Well, that's very kind of you to say, but I was always amazed at how fervently and enthusiastically you dove into those edits and those drafts, and like you did it. It's just like you threw yourself at it, and that's something I've long admired about your approach to it. It was just like you took it, you digested it, and you fucking ran with it.
Yeah. Well, better highly coachable player. That's what they always said about me. So.
Awesome. Thanks to Sam, and thanks to you, CNFers, for listening and making the show possible. I make it for you. I'm setting up one-on-ones for the Patreon crew. Depending on tiers, there's a frequency of one-to-ones, and you might want to consider it. Patreon.com/CNFpod. For the Patreon crew listeners who have made it this far, at the start of every month, I get that little influx of monies as a result of you, and I just want to say thank you. It's been about 2 weeks since I submitted my second draft of the Prefontaine book to my big book editor, and I've just been kind of floating along, feeling kind of lousy about it. Like I've been wasting more time than I care to admit. I applied to an entry-level reporting job as an arts and culture reporter, which seems pretty cool. Which is always kind of a bummer to be applying to an entry-level job when you're on the cusp of turning 44. And then, the only jobs in journalism these days seem to be either entry-level or buyout. What a career. My days are kind of like picking flowers. I sample a little of this and pluck from over there. Oh, wait, maybe I should go over there. The kitchen is looking a mess. Better clean it. I'm hungry for the 5,000th time today. Better go eat. And then feel shame for eating because I know I should lose about 10 to 15 lbs. At 5'9", 200 pounds, I'm a little thick, and I'm built like SpongeBob. We did yet another great O'Mara clean out, where we go room by room and get rid of shit. We do this at least once a year. I looked at my podcast reading shelf, and it's just, it was overflowing. Good problem to have, but overflowing and overwhelming. And, my God, dozens of books that I just have no time to get to. I couldn't get to them when they got to me. Some books dated back all the way to 2018. So I just declared, and this word is kind of hard for me to say, it's something I coined, bookruptcy. Instead of bankruptcy, bookruptcy. If the book was from 2021 or earlier, I got rid of it to the tune of about 75 books. I can sell maybe half of those and get a little bit of cash just for fun. The remainder went to a network of little free libraries in my community, and admittedly, the bookshelf now seems manageable for now. As a result of the Great America Cleanout, we usually consume a steady amount of boozy goodness to make it more bearable and just a little bit more fun. I had about 10 beers over the course of the day. I'm not bragging. 5 IPAs and of elevated alcohol content, and about 5 Coronas, because got to rehydrate. I woke the next morning and forgot that I was supposed to donate blood. So I shot up out of bed at like 10 to 7 in the morning. So I chugged a liter of water and got down to the blood center just in time. And the person who took my initial iron readings and then my blood pressure, it read 146 over 93, and she very earnestly looked me in the eye and asked if I was feeling okay. I was like, I feel fine. Book panics, but otherwise fine. I wasn't even hungover. You would think I would be, but I was had all those beers over the course of about 10 hours, so it wasn't like you got that flush of feeling like garbage or being hammered, but still, it took its toll on the body. And that is very binge drinky. Even if you're not getting hammered, that's still a lot of alcohol to put into a body. And if you go to any reputable medical website, it'll tell you that blood pressure reading of that nature it's at like stage 2. It's at the end. It's at the end of the bell curve where there's cause for concern, if not medication, if not multiple medications, as the Mayo Clinic suggested. Now, I'm not even in terrible shape. I'm an active guy in his mid-40s. I could spare to lose 10 to 15 pounds of fat, probably. It'd be hard because I'm at that kind of weight range where it's really hard to even lose 1 pound because I'm not like obese. Though BMI would probably say I'm obese. I don't know anymore. I could sweat a bit more on the day-to-day. I had a cousin a few years ago who at 36 died from a stroke. And maybe he had high blood pressure, among other things. I had an uncle who never drank, who definitely had high blood pressure. He was pretty high-strung. I consider myself pretty high-strung, too. And he dropped dead in the shower at like age 67, maybe 69. I think it was 69. Either way, in his 60s. And it might appear that I'm trending toward that direction. And if I'm not careful, I could maybe drop dead at any second. I go back to donate blood in 8 weeks. I do this every 8 weeks. I consider it the introverts community service. And I will not binge drink as he did the day before. I probably will scale way back on alcohol, if not abstaining altogether. I have no problem doing that. I sometimes go months on end without alcohol at all. And I always thank myself on a Saturday morning, waking up at say 6 or 6:30. I'm like, wow, I don't have that gross mouth feel of having had too many things to drink the night before. I don't have that weird foggy grogginess I wake up sharp and kind of re-energized. I'm like, wow, that's tomorrow me never regrets not drinking. Almost never, like almost unilaterally never. And so I'll try to, drop a few pounds. Maybe in 8 weeks I can maybe drop like 4 to 5. That would be nice. And that might be good for my heart and my elevated cholesterol. And as a longtime vegan, my body just generates cholesterol like it's going out of business. It's like, here you go, buddy. Have some more cholesterol. I'm going to try no caffeine after noon. Try to watch the salt. You don't eat a lot of processed stuff, but I am heavy-handed with salt. I like salt. The usual stuff. Maybe my blood pressure reading will come back into a range that isn't a harbinger for a truncated life. And you want me to keep going and speaking into this PR40 microphone. Am I right? Right? So take a deep breath, man. And if you can't do, interview. See ya.